Thank you. And thanks to the co-conveners, to Scott, to Peter and to Anna for the invitation today. I'm really happy to be here to talk to you about this. So thank you for the opportunity. I also wanted to thank you for moving the time so that I didn't have to get up too early, and I hope it wasn't too inconvenient for everybody here. It's much appreciated. I'm talking to you today about an approach I've developed specifically to help researchers understand how communications practitioners go about their work. The approach developed as a set of problem-solving tools to help me with research projects that focused on the professional practice of media workers. Hang on, just gonna. I suppose it was fairly natural for me that it came about like this, because it was natural for me to want to be among the communications practitioners as they went about their work, as I carried out my research. It was probably because I came out of journalism that I felt most comfortable doing my research like this. I'd been a journalist for 17 years before I became an academic, and the previous 10 had been at the BBC. And so there was a natural inclination for me to go to the scene of the action to gather the materials that I needed to tell the stories that I wanted to tell. In addition, it was made clear by academics at the time in journalism studies that there was a clear need for more newsroom ethnographies. Media researchers were tending to rely as research tools on the products of news and other communications practices, and on surveys and interviews with practitioners. So as the news industry transformed, I felt that I could make a contribution, bring fresh insights, if you like, if I researched inside newsrooms, observing where the decisions were made and where the products were produced. There are 4 research projects involving journalism practice during which I developed this methodological approach. Each has involved going to multiple sites of practice, and the logos that you see there are some of the places that I visited and carried out research. I thought it would be helpful if I went through each project very briefly, so to talk about them, just so that you can see how the methodology developed across those 4 projects. The first project was this textbook, and it was undertaken when I was teaching at the University of Leeds and was still working at the BBC. One of the places that I visited was the Anna Nova Orange newsroom, and you can see Anna Nova there. She was the first virtual presenter in the UK, and she was launched in 2000, in April 2000. At the time, the Anna Nova developers actually claimed that in 20 years, which would be 2020, most presenters would be virtual. I also visited the first online newsroom at the BBC in Leeds, and those were the 2 guys that ran the newsroom. And, you know, this was indicative of my approach. My approach to writing the textbook was not to just write about my experiences or take in the literature that had already been written, but it was to actually visit newsrooms and get the experiences of other journalists working with different backgrounds than mine, working in different newsrooms. So it was natural, really, that I took an ethnographic approach. Eventually, I visited 6 newsrooms, and I shadowed and talked to about 20 journalists, taking field notes and backing that up with still images. What I found was that while journalism was still being conducted in a largely traditional way, reporters would interview the sources that they always had interviewed. News selections were the same, but I noticed that things were beginning to change. For example, at the BBC, the online guys that you saw in the previous slide were forging new relationships with the audience. One told me, you know, you're reporting what politicians are doing, and that's fine. But our discussion board tells us that the audience is actually more interested in bus timetables. And while Much reporting, as I said, was traditional. And as you can see here from these pictures here, more reporters at that time were being expected to be multi-skilled. So fast forward a few years, and my second project was born out of concern at what I was seeing was happening to journalism. By this time, I'd emigrated to New Zealand with my family. I was doing some PR work for an environmental charity, and I became concerned by how easy it was for me as a PR officer to get media releases published almost unchanged in the mainstream media, meaning that the view of the charity that I had presented was being put to the audience unchallenged, unchanged. And I saw, I suppose, what I thought was a PRisation of news. And so this project was born. But before doing the field work, I carried out a small project just to check my hunch, and looked at the amount of PR that was getting into news in New Zealand, and it was pretty substantial. So I decided, though, that I had to understand both sides of the issue, both how and why journalists were so receptive to PR materials, and on the other side, how PRs were designing their media materials and with what aim. And so I carried out an ethnographic observation in PR offices as well as in newsrooms. And among the newsrooms I visited was the Auckland Live newsroom, which was the first dedicated online newsroom in NZ. So the Anna Nova Orange newsroom was the first online newsroom in the UK. And now I was at the Auckland Live, the first New Zealand dedicated online newsroom, which I thought was quite good to see the comparison. And it was quite new at the time. Again, I shadowed individual practitioners as they worked, as well as attending meetings with them. But now, instead of a stills camera, I took a video camera with me, and I videoed the individuals as I was shadowing. I made the change basically because at that time cameras were much more portable than they'd been those several years earlier. Also, there was a longer battery life, and they had memory cards instead of tape. So in the newsrooms, though, I noticed that they preferred the smaller cameras. So I actually got myself a set of flip cameras, and I used those, and they worked. I wasn't sure at the start what I'd actually be able to capture, but I knew it would be more than I could with a stills camera, and I was right. So overall, what I found was that the collapse of the funding model of news and the fact that there were fewer journalists in the newsroom, and those that were there were having to work across more platforms. And many journalists, for example, were working across at least two platforms: their legacy platform, whether that be the newspaper or the or broadcast, as well as online, meant that actually they were quite grateful to get the information subsidies that were provided by the public relations practitioners, whether they be pre-formulated copy or pictures. They felt that this was actually, on the whole, they felt it was the help fulfilling what they felt was actually a big news hole for them. But what I did find was, while they were grateful for the information, they were aware that PR was not a neutral, these were not neutral messages they were getting. But what they were unaware of was just how much planning public relations practitioners put into the formulating of their materials. They put a lot of time into designing all of their media messages, and there was a clear intention of influencing the news agenda. Journalists were not aware of quite how much effort went into this. I've got a short clip here of the Mayor of Auckland summing up the messaging, or the rhetoric, as he refers to it, of a large building project planned for Auckland's waterfront. This meeting that you see here has lasted for about an hour, and it's in preparation for an interview with a reporter from the New Zealand Herald, which is the country's most influential newspaper. His PR officer is here on the right, and there's a chief architect is on the left, just partly off the frame. There are drawings for the plans in front of them, and they're all on the table. The whole meeting shows a high level of preparation and planning.
And I will get the record around this for the purposes of the Herald article, just simply saying to people, here are some ideas, here are some opportunities beyond the red fence. They haven't all been costly. They don't all have to be done last week.
Okay, so you can see how he's actually, you can see him rehearsing the messages there. My next project overlapped with the previous one that you've just seen, possibly because of the work I was doing in newsrooms at the time. But now I wanted to move my focus from PR sources to consider how journalists were harnessing social media sources and tools in news gathering, and in New Zealand as well as elsewhere. So besides looking at New Zealand newsrooms, I also visited the LA Times and the BBC. Now, in light of what I found, I set up a research team at AUT known as the EJE team, and you can see them pictured there, dedicated to understanding social media use in news, also to upskilling ourselves as academics and to reworking the curriculum to both reflect and to influence what was happening. For example, we created and distributed to newsrooms 2 booklets on the basics of verification. We also, of course, use them in our own classrooms. What I found among journalists here was there was an acceptance that social media had a potential for news gathering and news dissemination, but there was a feeling that they were incompatible with the traditional way of reporting. And I also found that many senior journalists felt ill-equipped and worried that their newsrooms were being plunged into a world that they didn't understand with possibly unintended consequences. And the interviewee here is a typical example. He's incidentally from the LA Times.
My feeling is people just don't know what to make of what's going on. I mean, it's been such a dramatic shift for print journalism. I mean, before, in LA Times, we never cared about, I mean, we care about breaking news, yes, but the premium was not on breaking news and television. It was on thoughtful, analytical stories, trend stories, well-written Sunday stories. And, you know, we still have to do that, but we can't do it the way we once did because we're servicing the web and we're writing shorter stories. So the comparison I use for that is we hired a bunch of people who were marathoners and 10K runners. And in the past 5 years, we've asked them to become middle distance runners and sprinters. So people are really torn in a lot of different directions. And I think part of this is, you know, people are scared. I mean, obviously the business is under great pressure and they're just trying to figure out what best to do. And I think when you're scared, you don't know what's going to work, you put pressure on everybody to do everything all at once. And also we're trying to do everything all at once with fewer people. So it can be a little stressful.
So the changes wrought to news by these new technologies naturally led to my current project. And it revisits the practice of journalism in the light of digital disruption, disinformation, and the public's dwindling trust in journalists and the news media. At the moment, around 300 hours of newsroom interactions and interviews have been collected, most of which has now been transcribed, which has been a bit of a job. This is a much larger data set than I've ever collected before, and it involves more concentration on the on-screen activities of journalists, including the collection of digital artifacts, both their reception as they came into the journalist and their creation as the journalist put them together. And these have all been collected through my filming. Again, what I found is that traditional skills are still required. As this television reporter shows, he's persuading some reluctant interviewees to go on camera. And incidentally, it's not often that researchers get to see these sorts of interactions interactions between journalists and sources, as they are, if we were to take Goffman, actually the back of the backstage. However, this reporter, besides gathering material for his television story, this reporter also had to upload stills and audio to the online collaborative software Slack that his newsroom used, so that the digital team could put together reports on the online site and the radio team could put together stories for their audience. He also, in fact, did a live radio interview. You can see him on the phone there doing that interview. His television story, though, had to be sent from the field, from the side of the road, actually, as he was hundreds of kilometres from the office. Hence, he wrote the television script, which he recorded. He's under that little blanket there in the car, recording his script, which he sent back with pictures on what was a jerry-rigged live view, and the cameraman's holding part of it there, which was made by 4 SIM cards. And apparently it gave a 4G connection, so they were able to send everything back to the office. And as we were driving back, we watched his report on the mobile phone. Now, the overlap of platforms and the integration of digital tools into everyday journalism practice, as seen in that previous example, was evidenced everywhere, as was work acceleration because of the continuous deadlines, and work intensification because of the increased number of tasks that one reporter had to carry out in any one shift. For example, in this next clip, here's a radio reporter, you can see her there, is ringing a television reporter who is out at the scene of a fatal police shooting. Now, the radio reporter wants to know if there are any updates for the next bulletin. And she'd been expecting an audio clip from a witness to have been uploaded to the Slack channel that they were using. And so she'd been keeping an eye on the Slack channel for that update. And the television reporter had diligently been filing both text, short little text updates and still images to that Slack channel all day. However, as we'll see, when it came to the audio clip, the television reporter didn't use the Slack channel. She actually sent the audio clip by email. So the radio reporter had missed it. And that's one of the interesting things, I think, about this clip, that it shows, again, what I saw quite a lot, that there was an issue with using all these multiple technologies, and also just how many different tools were being used in the simplest of journalistic tasks. I'd like to have a look, as I'm playing this, just have a look at how, it's a 90-second clip, just how many tools this journalist actually uses.
Oh, 2. Hi Cleo, it's Erin here. How's it going? Hey, do you have any updates on what's happening? Okay, no, that's all good. I've got it here. Yay! I should have checked that before I rang you, actually. Oh, okay. Cool. Cool. Yeah. No issues.
Okay, I'm sorry for the hard edit there. So it's not always clear to a reporter which channel they should be using, and sometimes capability can lag behind as well. And so a reporter then will fall back on what's familiar. In this case, it was the email. So this reporter eventually found, obviously, where that clip with the witness was, but it wasn't where it was expected. And this I found quite a lot, that knowing where to contact people, where to get things, can be a problem. Did anyone notice how many technologies the reporter actually used? There were 8. In 90 seconds, she used 8 technologies. The old one, pen and paper, to note the number from the online contacts list that she got for the reporter. She then phones the reporter from a landline phone, but as she's ringing her on the landline phone, she's also checking messages on her mobile phone. She then checks Slack as she's told that where the audio has actually gone, and as if she's looking at Slack to check that it wasn't there. But then she goes to her email and she downloads the file to editing software, and that editing, you saw the CMS just to the left, is where the clip will go with the intro at the end. So in that 90 seconds, she actually referred to eight different technologies. Incidentally, in that story, she'd also looked at the Google Maps, and she used a Google Doc. So in my first research project, there was little understanding of the affordances offered by online tools. In the second and third research projects, there was, which overlapped, you saw that there was a little bit of resistance. You saw the sort of tired kind of resignation of the Los Angeles Times reporter that was typical of what I saw. In this data set, I found that today's journalists engage with a range of technologies all day, every day, whether it be to source information from social networks or to collaborate with colleagues from using online collaboration software such as Slack. They are using technologies all the time. And so the adaptation of journalism routines to include social media communication as well as email and a range of apps, as I've mentioned, has greatly affected editorial daily practices in the newsroom, to the point where talk about and use of the tools has become normalized. And as I've said, despite the rationale, incidentally, that runs through all of this, that new technologies make news production faster, my ethnographic observations of newsroom practice and the analysis of digital texts point to work intensification, acceleration of tasks, and increased pressure on journalists to conform by upskilling. Incidentally, that television reporter that didn't actually know how to upload audio to Slack, the journalist there actually talked her through it and taught her. So there's peer-to-peer training going on as well. So you can see how my research developed from taking still photographs of those that I shadowed to filming them as they went about their work, to including the filming of their online interactions as these became more commonplace. But it's always, right from the beginning, been about examining how news is produced. And the problem of researching how news is produced, and it's the same, I think, for any professional practice, is that most of the interactions where decisions are made or where there are discussions with colleagues or sources occur in private meetings, normally inaccessible to researchers. In addition, journalistic interactions these days are often really complex. They often involve several platforms simultaneously, as well as conversations between staff in the same physical newsroom space. So you can be trying to understand an interaction that's happening online and simultaneously in the same space. So to understand news production, all of these different types of interaction needed to be observed and to be captured. So it became clear early on that the only way to do this was through ethnographic fieldwork, taking the position of the participant observer. So very basically, and all of you will know this, ethnography takes you out of your own space and into the space of those being studied, allowing for the understanding and then the describing of those lives and behaviours, and of course, in their situated practices. The complexity of journalism's situated practices and the difficulty of taking accurate notes in such a complex daily environment meant that the interactions had to be recorded. The fact that so much goes on screen as well, including staff work emails, messaging on social media platforms, and of course collaboration on software such as Slack, meant that gaining access to those spaces I had to gain access, and also I had to be able to create a record of those interactions. So it was clear that video was needed. Now, drawing on McGilchrist and Van Hoot, the advantage of video, in my case, the advantage of ethnography, in my case, video ethnography, is the density of the data that it provides, which is just not possible with other methods. So, for example, it gives accurate non-verbal as well as verbal record, which can be replayed as necessary during the analysis stage, and that can be many times. And if you think about it, the video recording is a detailed reminder of the setting, of the activities, and of course the non-verbal actions of the participants at any given time. It's also clear from the footage who is speaking or acting and what they are saying at the time. Of course, there are limitations, but it's still a pretty good record. Now, McGilchrist and Van Hoot, they talk about the 3 thicks. There's thick participation, which is sustained involvement through fieldwork. Thick description, which is the recording of the activity in as much complexity as possible. And thick analysis, which is the use of multiple strategies of analysis on the data that has been gathered. So brought together, these 3 thicks allow the researcher to understand and to interpret the significance of the situated practices that were observed. Now, in planning and designing my approach, I was conscious that I was building on the work of others, from the pioneers of spoken interaction to researchers taking advantage of video technologies. My approach utilises many aspects of the approaches of these pioneers, tailoring them specifically to the recording and the analysis of professional interactions as they happen in what are often fast-moving and stressful situations. So I don't claim that my approach is a new approach, a wholly new approach. It's more of a collection of previous approaches that are brought together and adapted to my specific problem. And in this approach, which I've called ethnographic communication analysis, I use a combination of methods both for the data collection and for data analysis, aiming for that thick description and the thick analysis mentioned by McGilchrist and Van Hoot. In terms of data collection methods, in this approach, as you've probably observed, the video record of the interaction is the most crucial. It's the foundation on which everything else is built. And that includes face-to-face and on-screen activities and interactions. But to make it more robust, it is supported by semi-structured interviews and unstructured interviews that are captured at the time of the action, often explaining what is going on. Relevant other documentation is also collected. And that can be company reports, it can be training documents, that sort of thing. Anyone using this approach will end up with a huge amount of data. So how does the researcher decide what to concentrate on, what to analyse? Again, my approach looks to the pioneers for advice. It follows Gumpers, who stressed the importance of selecting representative samples from among the data. He said the aim is to discover strips of naturally occurring, naturally organised interaction containing empirical evidence. It also draws on Gitlin, who said a preliminary interrogation of the data should discover themes and the moments that matter in those themes. And this is the data that should be analysed. So to recognise the moments that matter, or the representative sample, I found it useful to turn to and adapt the critical incident technique. And I drew on Keating. I was influenced by Keating, who suggested changing the name from critical to revelatory or significant in order to work with the incidents that are more universal, that are more relevant. And so the incidents that I analyse in my research have to conform to 3 criteria. I have to have captured the entire incident, and sometimes that can go across several days. It had to be an interesting example of a significant event that I saw I saw in the practice. And this aspect of the practice had to have been seen routinely in the data. So I wasn't looking for outliers. I was looking for the things that really represented journalism practice, or when I was doing PR practice. In other words, the strips of data chosen for analysis were interesting examples identified as indicative of the professional practice observed during the research. So they were genuine moments that mattered. They were genuinely significant and genuinely revelatory. Here is a moment that mattered. It's not the most complex, but it shows my method. Just to explain so that you know what's going on, we're seeing a PR consultant on the phone to the CEO of a client organization, which is millions of dollars in debt. He's rehearsing, a bit like we saw the Mayor of Auckland doing, he's rehearsing to the CEO a media message that will calm investors and that he has written that he hopes the company will approve to be released. In essence, the PRP's message is that the company needs to stress that the debt is because of an historical situation that is now largely resolved, so investors shouldn't worry about it. Oh, goodness, just a minute. There.
It's almost like we can say, well, yeah, we knew all that crap was coming because it's kind of historical anyway. And that's the stuff we were trying to clear the decks with, and that's why we had to redo our audit, and that's why we had to account for ANF. And I don't know if you had a look at what I wrote, but I just put in there, in some ways, getting rid of ANF gives you more clarity. And yeah, so we can almost say, well, yeah, look, all that news is awful, and it's really bad, but it's historically bad.
Yep. So when I start an analysis, I first identify all the relevant communicative modes, and then I analyse each of those separately. While there are multimodal researchers that do not privilege language over the other modes, this framework does. It recognises that in interactions involving communications professionals, it's often a struggle over language. For example, between journalism and its sources, it's whose messages, whose propositions should be privileged. Between editors and journalists, which angle should the story take, which sources are acceptable. Now, obviously, having a variety of resources to analyse has implications for the representation of the data in a transcript. I decided that because my strips of data were usually language rich, that I needed to separate the verbal from the non-verbal data in order to accurately present the analysis in a matter that could be understood. So here is an example of a transcript made up using the framework. It actually takes that clip that we've just seen. So the linguistic analysis sees that the PRP is using several persuasive techniques, including repetition. There are three phrases in what he said that all started with the same words, and that's, which helps to frame a normalized version of the reality. And that's why, and that's why. The PRP obviously believes that an effective argument for the company is that everything the management has done, such as redoing the audit, is perfectly understandable in light of what has happened historically. Therefore, it's not now ongoing. And the PRP's non-verbal actions are used to aid him in putting this argument. They're co-expressive. And there's a clear divide between the gesture of the past, a sweep with his right hand across his body, throwing what was before over his left shoulder, to that indicating events that are ongoing or into the future, which is the right-handed wrist roll away from the body. He also represents his text that he's written with a little box there, showing that that's basically what he's written. It appears that he's using gesture as an integral part of his communication because he can't be seen by the co-participant. And this is consistent with Golden Meadow, who found that speakers still gesture even when they cannot be seen, as gesture has a communicative role for speakers, helping them to form their thoughts and their words. This is what incidentally, the analysis there, these are the kinds of, these are the sorts of modes that I look at, and there's some of the people listed that I turn to for help in the analysis with each of those. This is what the full transcript of that particular interaction looked like when it was published. So taking a closer look at the framework, in the analysis of spoken and written interactions, I rely on critical discourse studies and conversation analysis. CA helps me to understand pauses, non-lexical sounds, fillers, as well as specific language choices. Critical discourse studies, which tends to operate above the level of grammar, can help me to understand power relations. Looking at a text linguistic structure, we can see if certain ideologies are highlighted, while others perhaps are being downplayed or even concealed. I've got a little example here. In this example, we can see how public relations practitioners can view relationships with their publics as a risk management exercise rather than as mutually beneficial. So this extract comes from a meeting of a local authority's communication and marketing department. It follows the announcement of the authority's ending of the refuse and recycling contract with a locally owned company and the awarding of the contract to a multinational company. This change has angered a group of residents, and they've organised themselves into a group in protest. The meeting is discussing how to deal with this group. Now, just before the excerpt that we've got here on the screen, it becomes clear to the department's manager, Zara, she who has her head in her hands, that there is confusion about what has been arranged to address the group. So Zara takes control and she uses the discourse marker "so" twice to help her gain control of the meeting. She then uses a set of questions that are actually directives to clear up the confusion. So at the beginning of the excerpt, Zara makes a request, which is in effect a directive. So, can we just get the facts straight? The statement sets the scene, obviously, for what she wishes to achieve. To get the facts straight, and to make clear what it is that the council wants the contractor to do. Now, the way the words in the next question are ordered suggests another directive, despite it ending with a rising intonation, signifying a query. It's not, it's actually a directive. So we are going to talk to them and give our advice. The third, and she doesn't require a discussion here, but she does require a response. Yes, and she gets a yeah. The third leg to the question, that we think that without engagement, that the group are likely to be dangerous, clearly shows Zara's attitude to the problem, which she shows through stressing the words engagement and dangerous, but also those pauses before the words that she wants to ensure that they understand are important. And interestingly, she's using contrast to deliver her message as well, that without engagement, there is danger. The group is potentially dangerous. She later emphasises that they are also organised and ready for action. By framing the residents group, and they are a residents group, as dangerous, the manager is shaping the relationship with this public as a risk management exercise. And again, I saw this quite a lot in my research. So after analysing the speech, I turned to the non-verbal actions. And I only analyse, obviously, those that are involved in the interaction. And some of the most popular are listed there, the ones that come up the most. As I've said, they're usually co-expressive with the speech, and they're usually used to back up, to augment, or or used as a memory to fluency. Very rarely do gestures actually show something that's totally different to speech, and it's fascinating when they do. Sometimes, of course, they can be used on their own as well, but as I said, mostly in my research, they are co-expressive with the speech. And as I said, I've listed a few of the most common there. I've got time just to show you one example. In this interaction, gaze patterns between the participants indicate difficulties. For most of this interaction, the speaker, Matt, who you see there, is looking down. He does not look at the person that he's talking to. He either looks down or he looks into the middle distance. Stuart, the person who's being spoken to, incidentally, looks at Matt most of the time and actually leans into him because he's trying to make up to Matt because he's actually refused to give him a report that Matt has been wanting for months. Matt, incidentally, even looks away during listening. And this gaze pattern is particularly unusual, as listeners normally look at speakers with fairly long gazes. So looking away during listening and during speaking indicates dissatisfaction with the other's speech. And as I said, the gaze pattern matches as well what's being said. Matt is not happy. What he's actually saying is, but that's fine, but I mean. So the use of the contrastive marker but indicates actually he's not fine at all. He's unhappy. And in fact, he's still going to go to the Ombudsman office to complain. And he thinks in the end, of course, this could be ruled that they were wrong. They, incidentally, being the council, as he's talking to Stuart. So in summary, data gathering in this approach involves video ethnographic fieldwork, semi-structured interviews, documents, and field notes. To select the data, the researcher has to spend time soaking in the data to extract the themes. And once the themes are identified, the use of critical incident techniques to identify those moments that matter for that deep dive of analysis. And then that particular interaction is then analysed mode by mode. The research approach introduced here allows for the empirical study of areas of professional practice that have proved difficult for researchers to access. And it's hoped that ethnographic communication analysis, or versions of it, can be utilised by other researchers interested in understanding how, in practice, professionals interact and carry out their daily duties. It's been tested. It's been used successfully by several of my my PhD students. One has completed last year, looked at Maori journalists and how they navigate the requirements of tikanga, which is the Maori way of doing, while practicing as journalists. Another is looking at journalism practice in Papua New Guinea. Another who's just finishing now has looked at UGV in television news. And yet another is looking at political PR in India. Has actually spent time in a political PR department attached to one of the main parties. So I believe we've tested the approach, and I believe it can help anyone who needs to examine what are often taken for granted activities of professionals, especially the subtleties of power and influence. And these often cannot be accessed in interviews because they're so taken for granted. Thank you.